Hi, this is Jeff Cassman with Catholic Men of America, and today I'm with Michael Thomas. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me on today.
Glad to have you here and excited to talk about, well, your background, which is interesting to say the least, and what you're doing. There you go. We can.
I'm excited to be here, Jeff. Thank you for giving me a platform to your audience, and looking forward to our conversation today.
And speaking of backgrounds, you've got a real background there, right?
That's a legitimate background. I'm just in from yard work, so little flush. We're going through a hot spell here in New York, but yep, this is my house behind me, which is also the headquarters of the Catholic Land Movement.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to following up on a couple of those things. So you're from New York. Tell us about your background.
Yeah, so I've been the executive director for the Catholic Land Movement for about 2 years. Prior to that, I worked in residential construction management. I had a close to a decade career there. Prior to that, or kind of in sync with that, I've run a small homestead farm operation, just flirting with market access for the past 10 years. About 13 years ago, I planted an orchard of a 15-acre orchard, about 2,000 trees out on a property in upstate New York. I also raise catotted sheep. And so I have again, almost to scale, like 30 ewes catotted sheep flock that manages my orchard. Prior to that, I was a paramedic. Prior to that, I had apartment buildings and other stuff. I think your audience is interested in business and kind of how people mature through professional life. So maybe we'll talk about a little bit of that with me. But I found a real synthesis of like my professional history and my intellectual kind of trajectory and my spiritual life is coming to this type of restful conclusion in my work with the Catholic Land Movement. So that's how I have 6 kids. I've been married for 16 years, and just this past June 7th, that'll make 16. So I really enjoy what I do. I'm willing to talk, about any aspect of my story, from farming to small business to Catholic Land Movement stuff. I'm excited to have a conversation with you today.
You told me when we were talking before this call that you grew up on Long Island, typical big Italian family. Were you all devout?
No. I think the older generation, our family, I think, fell to what many Italian families in like suburban Long Island fell to throughout the 1970s and 80s. There was a boomer, my parents are the boomer generation. And prior to that, my grandfather was an Italian immigrant who also, stormed the beaches at Normandy. So the majority of my family in that generation, of that great generation, were all from Brooklyn. We had great uncles and a whole extended family. My grandmother on that side was one of 18. Big Italian family in Brooklyn. And so I have really fond memories of like being a little kid and going back to Brooklyn to kind of like, Christmases and, that very kind of New York Italian Brooklyn upbringing, plastic on the furniture, Amaro after meals, Sambuca in the coffee, very, very, very Italian upbringing, big family. But I grew up in suburban Long Island. So my parents were working class, but my youth experience was, I don't know, how do I explain it? Like very Spielberg, right? It was like riding little BMX bikes around a suburban neighborhood. That was my experience. Star Wars and He-Man. I know there's a redo of all that nowadays, but that was my childhood. And so very far from any type of rural encounter. My dad he had a bologna route. He sold bologna in Manhattan. So he would drive a truck in and kind of sell cold cuts. If people are familiar with like Boar's Head, My father had a Ridgewood route, and my mother was a school bus driver. So like I was very kind of middle class, ranch house in Long Island, lower middle class, and that was my upbringing. I didn't move upstate until I was maybe 19 or 20 years old. And then I actually didn't move to a rural setting and actually begin to operate a farm until I was into my 30s. So it was probably 31 or 32 that I actually started farming. And that's kind of a long story. So happy to cover that. But that's my background as far as American experience goes. I have these memories of cannolis and street fairs in Brooklyn as a small kid. But then my childhood and teenage years was a very Long Island experience. And then everything post 19, I moved upstate and kind of slowly worked my way into a rural community. And now I've been farming for, well over a decade. And that's a big part of my identity now.
You don't talk like you grew up in Brooklyn with that typical Italian upbringing like Southerners like me think about when we watch Sopranos or see TikTok videos of New York comedians. So what happened to you?
Yeah, we're tricky, but we live everywhere. Where you'll find us in all places. We don't all talk the same. But yeah, no, I really do come from a very big Italian family, and yeah, I was North Shore of Long Island. So it's very interesting. Like my cousins and everybody who grew up on the South Shore of Long Island picked up the Queens accent, the Brooklyn accent. But I'm North Shore of Long Island. I grew up in a little town called Bayville. Little more Anglo, a little more North Shore, Gold Coast, and I think I escaped much of the accent. But give me enough glasses of wine and a big enough dinner table, and it'll come out of me. So it's there. So yeah.
And what you got to tell me about this bologna route? I've never heard of such a thing.
Yeah. So my dad was he had a box truck, with an AC on it. And every morning he would leave at like 4 o'clock in the morning, and he would drive into Brooklyn, and he'd pick up at this time the whole Williamsburg area, which everyone knows now as like destination ground zero for high-rise apartments and the rest of it. In the 1980s, Williamsburg was Polish bakeries, Jewish delis, and Italian warehouses. That was the majority of what Williamsburg was. And so my dad would drive into Williamsburg, and he would pick up, cold cuts and meats, and he built a route of delis throughout Manhattan and really all the 5 boroughs. And he would drive that route, and then he'd, drop off making pennies on every ham sale that he made. And then he'd come back to my little house in Bayville. And so it really does, though. It's a good thing to focus on, because it does. I think a unique focus here, which I like, is that a lot of guys who are listening to your podcast are interested in business, and it really this set up for me a background in small business. I saw my dad not working in a corporate environment, but having a type of hustle that he put together that was legitimate and virtuous, and interfacing with the market. But he was out there. He was getting accounts with Korean bakeries and Jewish delis and Middle Eastern guys. And he would sit me in his truck every once in a while, and I'd go on his route with him, and he'd be talking to everybody, selling hams and bolognas, at a penny markup on each one, and he made a life out of it. So that kind of small business ethos is something that's baked into me. And I think I've expressed that throughout my life. No matter what I've done, it's always kind of had that type of business ethos of scrappy, putting it together yourself, shoestring, figuring it out as you go along, but also making it work, also making it serve a family and be financially gainful. And I think I've, throughout my life, I've been able to platform that over and over again, regardless of what industry I'm kind of hopping into. So yeah, that's my background. That's what I witnessed as a kid.
That's great. And then at 19, you moved upstate. What took you upstate?
Yeah, so I was started to go to SUNY Albany. I didn't really make it too far. I got pinched by a like a lobby group in upstate New York that was working on some environmental policy. I was like a student activist. I was doing organizing. Grassroots organizing was like part of my matrix and what I was doing. And I was asked to fulfill a position on a campaign that was doing some like environmental work up and down the Hudson. And I took the job. So I like kind of left college. I came up at 19 thinking I was going to go to school, and instead I took a job. I did lobby work for this environmental group with the New York State Legislature, like very starry-eyed, very idealistic, very like, this is the peak of grassroots campaigning. We built a platform that now I can approach the state legislators and, get them to act in the interest of the common good and so on and so forth. And, I got there and it was very, very different from that and somewhat bewildered by the state of New York politics in terms of just how degenerate it was and how non-functional and quid pro quo and just kind of awful New York State politics was, and it disillusioned me very quickly, and that kicked me into a phase of my life where I was very much just interested in local organizing. So I got a certificate to teach reading. I got a certificate to be a paramedic. I worked in, small city schools in Albany. I got very involved in like community organizing for community centers and other things, and really kind of put myself on the forefront of issues that affected communities stricken with, the kind of consequences of poverty and other things. And so I got involved in land trusts and anti-violence organizations and community projects and schools, and at night I would work as a paramedic. So although my Catholic identity wasn't strong at that point, this idea of self-sacrifice and service to the poor and preferential treatment of the poor, which is very Catholic in its nature, was very forefront in my thinking. Like, this is what was guiding my life. And so I spent a lot of my 20s as a community organizer, school teacher, paramedic in downtown Albany.
When we Southerners think about a lot of the terms that you've shared, we associate those things with democratic politics. But I know in New York State, New England, that's not necessarily true. How did you identify in terms of your politics at this time?
Yeah, so America always likes to, whenever they hear about any type of cultural or lifestyle position, there's always the immediate binary of like, is it red or blue, which is a sickness of Americanism, in my opinion. But I was very much blue at that point, but only out of a practical necessity that there was no red. There was no red in Albany. I was a localist. I was concerned with access to property, with good food, with a kind of community organization that brought people into contact with first things and real community. These were all things that on the blue red of Americanism binary were very blue in Albany. So just out of a practical set, I was aligned with blue stuff. I worked on like anti-globalization stuff. It's actually fairly interesting. If you know who he is, Paul Kingsnorth writes a very good article recently where he discusses how trade unionism, kind of nationalistic patterns of industrial production, the like onshoring of the confrontation of globalism, the confrontation of usury economy, or all these other things used to be in the late 90s. These were like left issues, right? The trade unionists were marching with the left wing in Seattle, Washington in 1999, right? These were, and somehow this anti-globalization, this populist orientation, this localist orientation around production patterns, nationalism, all of these things kind of migrated to the right over from 1999 to 2016. All of those things migrated to the right, and then eventually became the platform which Trumpian populism kind of like propels itself into control of the civic authority on these issues, on these very issues. I'm going to confront inflation. I'm going to onshore labor. I'm going to, and so we see these issues literally migrate from left to right in that 20-year period. I was absolutely part of that migration. I definitely followed that migration in my own life as I moved from an urban area that was dominated by blue hat politics to a rural area that was championing exactly the same issues: farms, localism, nationalized production, confrontation of financial economies that keep people from owning property and things, right? These all became red issues, especially in rural places, post NAFTA, post all that stuff, and into 2016. And I was definitely part of that red hat of 2016. And so I think a lot of people my age, 45, so my other 45-year-olds who are with me, I'm going to say, I think is it Churchill or Chesterton? I don't know. A portly Englishman once said, if you're not left wing, I'm going to paraphrase, if you're not left wing when you're young, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you don't have a brain. I think a lot of people can appreciate that transgression for people over the 20 years from 99 to 2016.
Yeah, I think that was Churchill, but
okay.
Might be wrong. But okay, wonderful background, and I think that sets the stage very well. You mentioned you've got 6 kids. What are the ages?
Okay, 23, 16, 14, 6, 4, 9 months. So
wow,
yeah. So I got a spread there. God's plan.
Yeah.
That's the way it happens for some people. So that's the way he had it happen for us. So, yep, that's my spread.
That's great. God bless you for that, for being open to it. Let's talk a little bit about Catholic land movement. That's probably what most people watching want to hear about. I can't remember hearing anything about it growing up, even 10 years ago. And then all of a sudden you all were out there and being talked about and growing. And part of what we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes is just the amazing growth you've had. So give us the background, if you would, on Catholic land movement, and then share how you came to be a part of it.
Yeah. So I had I think we've gone through it. My personal experience actually is a great illumination of the growth of land movement, because I arrive at my late 20s in a position where I've been disillusioned by the political binary of America. I've been disillusioned by or really compelled for the safety of my family that like an urban environment is an unhealthy place, especially downtown Albany, right? There's riddled with gun violence, environmental pollution. It's not a great place to live, And that while I can make that sacrifice for myself in an attempt to serve the poor, or like put myself on the front lines, it's wrong for me to make that choice for a 3-year-old little boy, right? And so, or my children. And so we found ourselves in a place where we said, what do we want for our family? My wife and I began to discuss like our long-term vision, and we landed on, we want to be rural. We want to go live on a farm. And so a huge identity shift in that period of like late 20s for me, where I disengaged from politics and really took what I would say like an introspective or contemplative a trajectory in my life, where I went out to a farm. My wife and I bought a rundown farm in Schoharie County, New York. Going from one of the bluest counties in Albany to one of the reddest counties in New York, in Schoharie. We bought this old rundown farm, and we started to fix it up, and we lived very simply. Some of the first couple of years, like, we grew most of our food, and I had a type of contemplative period. I can express it no other way than I acquiesced to natural order in a way that was somewhat unique for your average person. We lived very simply, grew a lot of our food, and I spent most of my time outside, tending a garden, planting apple trees, taking care of a small, flock of animals, and living that way. And that kind of became our priority. We disengaged from media, we disengaged from everything. And in that humility, St. Augustine says, do you wish to rise, start by descending. In that somewhat humble position that we put ourselves, and I mean humble, not lowly, but humble in the sense of like in contact with what was real in our lives. Where does our food come from? The immediacy of our family, a prioritization of that responsibility and vocational work, my relationship with my wife as a husband, like that was my core focus. What happened in doing that is that humility to natural order prepared for me a reception of divine grace. And all of a sudden I found myself contemplating higher things. Who's God? What is God? What is truth? What is good? Why am I compelled to do certain things? And I had this kind of long process of introspection and contemplation, which invited grace into my life, and very kind of completing that process was my realization that my pull to service of the poor over all my youth and all the turmoil I experienced there, and like desire to do good, these were all very Catholic. I was Catholic. I was essentially Catholic, and I explored that more. I had this desire to pray, and I prayed the only prayer I knew, which was the prayer my grandma gave me. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus. This is the only prayer I knew, right? So I'm like planting trees and praying this. And then I start reading about Catholicism. I read confessions. I read, I start reading the social doctrine of the church, and I see all these concerns I had about localism and subsidiarity, and all these things are reflected in Catholic social doctrine. And I find this amazing synergy that kind of completes for me a cycle of intellectual discourse that puts me at ease. I'm like, oh, I'm Catholic. And in Catholicism, in the unity and truth that Christ brings into the world, all of these things are kind of settled. All of these things are integrated in the experience of being Catholic. And so I began to look at like, hey, where else? So at this point, I returned to sacramental Catholicism, not a serious part of my upbringing. Culturally, it was there, but I'm a cradle Catholic, but it wasn't a serious part of like the intellectual life of my upbringing. It begins to become a very serious part of my intellectual life. And as I see more of the gospel, and I see more of kind of Christ's perfection of the world, I invite that into my own life and become very engaged in like sacramental Catholicism, right? So Christ has left us this church, and I have a duty to it. And so that grows for me. So my wife and I, we go from like growing our food and being kind of left-wingy, hippie kind of people, and slowly over our course of being out in this rural place and stripping away some of the clutches of the world, we find that we're actually devout Catholics. And so we return to a very kind of serious sacramental life and a pursuit of a sacramental and liturgical life, and find that very, very edifying, very, very spiritually gainful, and really just, anybody who has had this experience of coming into the gospel and coming into being Catholic, just ontologically, like blows my doors off, right? Like being Catholic is beautiful. It's beautiful. I don't know how else to describe it. You don't need too many words. So in any event, I look for, after this experience and reversion, I look for where in the church, because as a good Catholic, you don't look for some novel experience, right? As a good Catholic, I'm going to look for where in the church has something like this happened to somebody else. You know, where is my experience echoed in the church? I'm not so unique that I've had this experience. Somebody else has had to have had this. And in that, I find, where is it here? It's actually sitting on my desk. Yeah, I find this book. I find Fleet of the Fields from IHS Press, which is, a series of letters and essays from Englishmen 100 years ago who are speaking to the cultivation of virtue by coming into contact with, first things and the land, and how those integrate into the liturgical life and prayer life and the cultivation of Catholic virtue. And I find this whole world of Catholic agrarianism, and that creates kind of like a natural pull for me of like, I've been given this amazing gift in my reversion. I want to connect with that intellectual patrimony of the church. And I continue to explore it. I mean, and it's like vast, right? There's just like, there's books after books. I've already mentioned Chesterton and like other people at Belloc and like, McNabb and there's this huge intellectual patrimony of agrarianism in the church. Particularly from English, but also from Spanish, French, the medieval period, tons of it. And so I connect with this and say, boy, I discover the Catholic land movement in that. I discover the Catholic land movement as a rubric for social action in that. And so we've talked enough now where you understand that, the beginning of my life was about grassroots organizing and kind of small business and kind of bootstrapping ideas, into functional plans. And so I see the Catholic land movement of yesteryear, and I'm like, this is a no-brainer. Why don't we have a Catholic land movement in the contemporary? And just like you, I hadn't heard much. I looked around, I didn't see much. I saw like one dead website. I saw a couple of references like here and there on EWTN. Like I didn't see it in a living thing. This is kind of easy, we can apply. Apply myself to the old rubrics of the Catholic land movement. I read them all, the 7 spiritual motives and the 7 practical means of the Catholic land movement methods. And I was like, man, if someone just did this thing would take off again. And so I started to do it, and I was right. it took off again. People rallied around it, and I've kind of been. That was about 6-7 years ago, and I've kind of been riding that since. In a way, it's just kind of grown. And we had our first conference. I remember I talked to some of the older fellows in my parish, and like we had a reading group, and we read Fleet of the Fields, and I was like, hey guys, like how do we get the Catholic land movement started again? And one of the older fellows, Fred, I was like, dude, have a conference. That's what Catholics do. They have a conference. And so I had a conference, and we put out a word for like, we're going to have a Catholic land movement conference. 2 weeks, 350 people had bought tickets for this conference. And I was just like, oh, wow, this works. That grew into a chapter network. That chapter network grew into, more chapters. That grew into like rubrics of best practice and social organizing. All at the same time, I'm gaining, like I'm bought in and diving deep. So I'm reading like all the encyclicals. I'm reading, deep the Cross and the Plow and Robbins and Shrove and even the Forgottens like Gill and the rest. Like I'm reading it all, and seeing that there's a very worthwhile rubric for social action from yesteryear, and really the whole thing is just applying that in the contemporary. And it's like our Lord says in the parable of the sower, right. Some to the crow, some to the weeds, some to the fallow earth, but it's the same seed, but eventually it's going to land on like ground that is fertile, and what's going to grow from there is profound, right? Just from that mustard seed. And so that's what I found with the land movement. And so I just happened to be the fella who was an instrument at like the right time and the right social condition. And as Americans, I think I've already expressed in this interview how tired I am of the American binary, how tired I am of the demagoguery of democratic, and I don't mean left and right democratic, but democracy. How so many people are ready for a type of post-liberal evolution of civic authority and social order. That the land movement provides a type of practical rubric for action in that direction. And so it resonates deeply with me, and I think it resonates deeply with a lot of other people. And so, yeah, we come to the moment now. It kind of carries us to the moment now. We have 91 chapters worldwide. I mean, next week Zimbabwe is going to have their first event. You know, Australia, Italy, England, 38 states in America. All day today, I'm constantly talking to people throughout the network. We're breaking ground on a multi-million-dollar farm project in West Virginia. There's just the land movements. It's just very, very robust. Again, not just Americans, but the world over. I believe people are ready for a type of kind of third position approach to civic order that's grounded in Catholic social doctrine. And so, yeah, that's it, Jeff. And then here we are. That's it. I'd love to. You know, there's so many different aspects of that. Again, back to the business perspective that I think is going to interest your audience. You know, how do we use subsidiarity, leadership training? How do we leverage the tools of communication and organization that various digital platforms allow us? There's like so much there to talk about. And I think the land movement has some very like unique answers to those things that are not just ideas, but actually practically demonstratably fruitful. You know, that this is how we're doing it, and it truly works. So yeah, that's
right. So let's talk so you've given us a great background and overview. Practically, let's talk about what you've done, where you started 6 or 7 years ago. You went from, you discovered it, you learned the history, you fell in love with it. What did you start to do, and then bring us current from starting point to 91 chapters?
Yeah. So like I said, we started with a conference. From that conference, we what were some of the next steps post-conference? Post that conference, we kind of rallied around key players, people who came to that first conference. It wasn't the what to do. It wasn't the what, or even the how. It was the who that was important. So we found that there were certain people that these ideas resonated with, that a method of like optimistic forward push was their personal disposition and orientation, and we worked with those people. And so we began to build like a leadership team and a leadership tier of land movement, and then ask those leaders out of their own like free will buy-in to the principles. I mean, one of the leverages that the land movement has is that it resides, its foundation is Catholic social doctrine. Its foundation is well-defined like principles 100 years ago. So very quickly, myself and a handful of other people who were part of the core leadership said, we're not going to get involved in reform discussions. We're not going to get involved in how the land movement needs to be reformed or reconstituted in order to appeal to the contemporary. We are going to just take the old principles and run with it. How do they apply? You know, the only reform that needs to happen is circumstantially in like methods, you know, but not the principles or the motives, right? And so I think that was actually a really important decision. I think that in the beginning, many times what I've seen with Catholic organization, and this is not just Catholic, but just in across the board in grassroots organization, is that people want to distribute very, very widely authority. and they want to make sure that everybody's voice is heard in strategic planning, and they get like paralyzed because they just have this argument about principles, and they just get a bunch of guys in the room arguing about principles, and then and they never come to a consensus, and like it fizzles out after a little while. So the land movement very immediately was like, we're unified on principles. Are you with these or are you not? If you're not, that's fine. Go take yourself elsewhere. Figure out what you're going to do with the people who are aligned with you. We're aligned on these principles. What we want to put together is people who are compelled for practical action, and we want to build a best practice for that practical action in the contemporary. And that worked, right? So then we started getting these chapter leads who were like, oh, I'm doing a workshop on this. I'm having a reading group. We're doing a mutual aid. We're putting a roof on somebody's house. And we began to build a portfolio of templates for social action that work, that were the barrier to entry for them was very low. We were not compelled in our beginning to turn it into to turn the organization into a means to support anyone economically. We were just trying to push forward the principles in a social action rubric. So I think that's another thing that sometimes Achilles various social movements, particularly we can see it like in the various media movements of like right-wing politics. You get this type of grift, right? You get this type of like personal guruism where people immediately like latch onto some social topic and then they want to turn it into like a media career, and everything's about like getting clicks, and then like it just takes the wind out of it, and that authenticity of principles that was there is just like diminished. And so the land movement escapes that because we're just like, no, 100 years ago, and we lean into subsidiarity. There's not going to be like a single guru or like anything like that. We want local action is got to guide it. We don't have any money. We have no money. You got to go do something, And so people start doing things everywhere. They start having workshops, reading groups, mutual aid, meetups, dozens and dozens, at this point, hundreds and hundreds of workshops. And slowly we begin to build a kind of toolkit for social action that pushes forward the ideals which are, motivating the Catholic land movement. And they prove to be cross-cultural, apparently. Even people in Spain or France or, Australia and Zimbabwe are compelled to these principles because the church is universal. The perennial truths that the church carries are universal. You will find the same truths in Rerum Novarum, and I know maybe some of the trads will hate to hear this, but you will find the same truth in Laudato Si as well. There is a resonance between these two things and a harmony between them. There is a perennial thread of truth that is pulled through Catholic social doctrine. And we choose in the land movement to focus on those moments of resonance and harmony rather than the moments of discord and division. And we choose to focus from that harmony to action. And I think that sets us apart. I think that sets us apart from a lot of the contemporary cultural narrative, which might focus on division, which might focus on, clickbait kind of stuff, which might focus on disembodied encounter on the internet. We're like all this interview, these, devices, all of it is all tools and means to generate real relational encounter between people that's grounded in fundamentally the integration of land, community, and God. And so when you're doing that, you're engaging a type of truth that is perennial, and the only institution that's held that perennial truth for any degree of time over the course of the rise and falls of civilizations is the Catholic Church. And so that's what we're connecting with in the land movement. And I think that truth is incredibly powerful. Conference, this focus on social action, and the grounding in Catholic social doctrine gives us a platform to, and then the focus on subsidiarity. The land movement does not land a spaceship in an area with like a program for people to buy into. The land movement attempts to distribute authority to local leaders. So the land movement kind of encounters somebody in a locality and says, hey, let's talk for a while. Let's make sure that you understand the principles. Now we're going to give you tools for social action. And if you prove yourself fit by a demonstration of good works, we're going to place upon you a note of authority. You're going to carry the land movement banner in your, locality. We want you to dialogue with the people there, but you're the authority, that creation of local authority. This is subsidiarity. And so this is, I think through that model, the land movement has been able to expand very, very quickly with very, very limited. We still only have like 2 staff people, yet there's 91 chapters. If you go on our website right now, you will find, I think, over 40 events throughout the world. We are very authentically motivating from local authority, kind of shoestring action, goodwill between Catholics, and the perennial social doctrine truths that are carried by the Catholic faith. And it's a powerful mixture, Jeff. That's just the truth of it. And so yeah, so that's how we're at now. Things really began to catalyze maybe 2 years ago. I think we were at that point, we're at like 30 or 40 chapters across America. And there was, regular stuff happening weekly or monthly. And we got an invitation through a bishop to go to the Vatican and like present what we're doing. And it was met with great interest by elements of the Curia and dicastery and other places. That turned into a relationship and kind of an ongoing dialogue. The dicastery is very open, and the Curia very open to dialogue, and so that kind of turned into this open dialogue where we were invited back to Rome and continued to talk to folks and kind of explain what we're doing, and we were greeted with like lots of support. They helped us make connections with folks. That turned into funding. Eventually that turned not through the Vatican. Vatican's not giving us any money, but private funds. And then that turned in eventually to a letter from Pope. We had a meeting with Pope Francis. He dies soon after. And then from that meeting, I can only guess, it landed in Pope Leo's lap, and we got a formal letter of support from Pope Leo very early in his pontificate. He gave us a formal letter of support, called us apostolic work. We made that letter public, and just kaboom. That really expanded the network. When we can go to bishops or religious houses now and say, hey, the Pope is saying that the work we're doing is good. Here's a mountain of testimony. Here's 1 million pictures from events around the world of people, processing pigs together, putting in gardens together, pushing up timber frames together. Like, here it is. We're doing corporal works of mercy. We're enacting, kind of a living expression of Catholic social doctrine. Support us. We find that support now in dioceses, religious orders, and laity. And so now we're really at the, I want to say a crescendo, but Deo gratias, it keeps on getting farther. So what I would have thought was the crescendo of like meeting a pope. The organizational kind of momentum of land movement just keeps on getting way past anything I could ever imagine. So at this point, I'm along for the ride, and just kind of playing my role as a servant instrument as best I can, despite all my various faults and shortcomings. So yeah.
You mentioned it. You were at 30 or 40 chapters a couple of years ago.
Yep.
Now you're at, did I get it right, 90-ish?
Yeah, it's like 91. It's always hard to say for me exactly because it's like a moving target. There's like, it's funny. I'm farming wise, I'm an orchardist, and people always want to like ask me how many trees do I have in my orchard, and it's like, how many productive trees, how many trees that are going to die next year, how many trees that are out of cycle this year from production. It's like the chapter network is kind of the same thing. There's some chapters that are like having an event like 2 times a month. They're organizing fundraisers and galas and dinners and like doing all kinds of stuff, and like their mutual aid is really strong. And then there's other chapters that have like an event once every 6 months, and then for us it's like we're happy to see anything happen because it's better than the nothing that was happening. But at the same time, not every chapter is created equal. So yeah, about 91 chapters.
And every chapter has to have a leader. What
Yes.
are you looking for in that chapter leader?
Great. So the first thing we take people through, like a leadership orientation, is one of the very first things that that people do with us. And the very first thing we mark four different major categories of what we look for in a leader. And so the first thing we look for in a leader is what we call strong executiveship. Yeah. So the core things that we look for in someone who would lead a Catholic Land Movement chapter, number 4. There's 4 major categories of kind of things we expect from leadership. And the first one is what we call strong executiveship. The Land Movement, somewhat in I don't want to say opposition, but the current like thinking around a lot of grassroots organizing is an inclusion of all voices in the strategic decisions of the organization. And we don't engage that in the Land Movement. So we kind of actively deny that. While we want our leadership and our chapters to absolutely encounter everybody who comes to the chapter in a spirit of dialogue and kind of meet them as whole people and interact with their talents and their needs and their circumstances. The point of Catholic Land Movement organizing is to be really clear that human sociality, in order to function well, needs hierarchy. And so we are really looking for someone to be the decision maker. We are really looking for someone to set the strategic agenda for a group of people, and then divide that strategic agenda into very clear goals that group of people can move through, and then divide that further into tactical lists that can be distributed and you can hold people to account on. And so we are very much about, in the Land Movement, establishing localized hierarchy, kind of the way that the church models itself, right? The bishop doesn't collect the priest to have a vote about what happens, right? So the bishop kind of decides. And so we're looking to set up a very similar model on the laity side. And this is the way the corporate model works as well. You might have a board. Usually boards are limited, right? And so it's usually an executive that's making the day-to-day decisions of strategic kind of navigating for a group. And so the Land Movement is looking for strong executives. So that's number 1. Are you the type of person who is comfortable setting the agenda, making that agenda focused on achievable strategic goals? And can you build tactical lists to orientate people on, distribute to them, and hold them accountable to? If that's not what your personality is like, if you're somebody who wants to just really talk about principles all the time, that's great. I mean, there's room in the social order for people like that, but it's not in leadership. If you're somebody who wants to involve every voice in a type of consensus decision-making project, program, that's great. There's place in social order for that, but it's not in leadership. And so the Land Movement is very clear about like looking for hierarchy and leadership. And that's the number 1 commitment. That's the number 1 thing. Number 1 is a funny way to say it, but that's the first thing we look for. If you're not oriented like that, Land Movement leadership probably isn't for you. The second thing we look for is kind of a professional level of administrative talent. Can you send emails, keep a schedule, make a flyer, take minutes, balance a checkbook? If you don't have those skills, can you organize and delegate those skills to somebody else? That's administrative. Essentially, as a leader, leaders are setting organizational agendas, but administrators are, an organization is as good as its capture of data, its organization of data, and its effective use of data, and we're clear about that. And so the second thing we ask for from leadership is to have a strong administrative base, whether it's a team or within that leader themselves, right? Again, some chapters are only having like 1 or 2 events a year, so it's not this huge load. But we're clear about it. You need to be a good administrator or have administrative talent as part of your chapter. 3, the the land movement arises from a very well-developed intellectual patrimony. You need to understand it to be a land movement leader. You can't just kind of ride in with your own set of principles and like mission drift the whole organization off into like some other thing. Like we are the Catholic land movement's mission is the Catholic land movement exists to facilitate the rural resettlement of Catholics onto productive property they own. That involves education, fellowship, the glorification of God. We have a very kind of well-formed program of mission. We ask you to understand it, understand the history of it, and understand why it's important in the contemporary. So that intellectual commitment to continual education around the intellectual motives and spiritual motives of the land movement. And then finally, we ask for obedience. We ask for obedience to the organization. We ask for obedience to the magisterium, obedience to the Catholic Church, and contemporary social doctrine. So those are the four elements of leadership that we kind of vet people for. So yeah, that's that formula of like looking for that. And I really think a large part of it is that first one, which is kind of novel in grassroots organizing. I want to deal like the main land movement wants to deal with a singular person who's succinct with the intellectual foundations of the land movement and is a competent administrator. If you're not those things, or it's like, I pay attention, the executive team and the various what we call joint committees that develop everything from propaganda to, fundraising to executive action and the rest of it. They pay attention most to the 20% of most active chapters, and then if you're not falling in line with that kind of the parameters of leadership, you're likely to get pruned, as the organization continues to move on. And so yeah, that's our method in terms of in our vetting of leadership. And that can look really broad, liturgically that can look really broad. Intellectually that can look styles of leadership that can look broad. But that's how we kind of hone it in. Strong executive, good administrative practice, an understanding of the principles, and a commitment to continual education, and an obedience to the organization, its strategic goals, and the magisterium and the contemporary church. And so that's just kind of like solves so many points of division, right out of the gate, that kind of kneecaps so many grassroots efforts.
It's exceptionally well thought out. So congratulations to you for that. And this leads me to my next question. There's a lot of romanticism among the people who are interested in this kind of thing. People who read Chesterton or Belloc, people who were raised like you in the city or like me in the suburbs, and they dream of farm life with their beautiful wife and a handful of kids, and they're collecting the eggs every day, and they're milking the cow, and the sun shines every day. Those of us that have done some farming, and I'm what my wife likes to call a gentleman farmer. I think by that she means that it's an expensive hobby, but we've raised pigs and rabbits and ducks and chickens and quail, even tilapia at one point, and we've tried to raise food in the dirt. This is hard work. It's even with technology and electricity and gadgets and friends that I can, text with a moment's notice and say, hey, how do I fix this? Even with all of this, for modern man, at least for me, this is hard work. And it's checkered with failure and frustration. And in the case of your animal's death, how do you deal with that? Because I got to believe you've got a lot of glassy-eyed romantics that come to you who love everything you're saying. They want to be a part of it. What do you say?
Right. So it's a matter. I feel like I'm almost lucky that I discovered bugs on my cabbage and mastitis in my goat before I discovered Chesterton. So maybe I'm a little lucky with that mix, but as it is, it's about being rightly oriented. I've seen many men kind of saddle up their family for a rural transition, and that rural transition is predicated on material markers of success, meaning, we're going to grow our food, or we're going to scale a farm, and, I'm going to be able to get rid of my day job in the corporate, accounting department, and, I'm going to quit my IT job, and I'm going to raise, goats, and, it's kind of the material side is almost predominant in the assessment of success and the endeavor, right? Does it create more comfort? The other realm is like the prepper realm, right? I'm doing all this because I'm prepping for some, eventual, societal collapse, because I'm so much more clever than everyone else. I see where society is going, and I've deftly placed myself in a position to avoid the material hardships of societal collapse, greater so than my brethren elsewhere, and both of these paths, as far as I've seen, lead to failure. Sorry to burst people's bubbles if that's anybody who's listening, but you cannot motivate or build your life around material acquisition and material circumstance as your bedrock, because that's not the way life works, gentlemen. Material security is a passing thing, and our Lord tells us many, many times in many, many ways that grounding ourselves in this world distracts us from the next and our true home. And so that, like, I'm going to get out of IT because I'm going to raise, chickens or whatever. It just overwhelms most men and families, and they've tied their metric of success to this material economic thing, and they just don't make it. And then the preppers essentially are motivating from fear, right? So they're motivating from a sense of fear. They can maybe they wrap it in a due prudence, but it's a fear and it's a pride. And so they end up sitting very lonely on a giant pile of cans with a lot of ammunition, and it's kind of ugly eventually, and it alienates people, and it's corrosive to their spiritual life. And so they're well prepped, but they're spiritually malformed. And so the land movement rightly focuses the idea that we engage a simple life. We engage a life of deep contact and communion with the landscape, deep contact and communion with our community, and deep contact and communion with God. That we are doing these things because we are cultivating within ourselves a type of virtue set and a character build that's going to carry not only us, but our brothers to the beatific vision. And motivating from that place, you motivate from love. And in that motivation from love, you encounter our Lord who loves us. And so you find like a wellspring of energy, ability to face conflict or hardship, ability to kind of accept the natural order in a state of humility that is instructive for you rather than demolishing of you. And then you use that to chisel in yourself a better person, one that is more built in the shape of a virtuous Catholic man. And so it's a whole different way to orient. I'm doing these things. I'm going out and growing food for my family. I'm going out and doing things because I'm glorifying God. The benefit is immediate. Even if I fail at growing the potato, even if my goat dies, then our Lord is instructing me with that hardship to some type of development of my character, and I'm pushing forward, right? I'm not just like, oh, now now I'm never going to leave my IT job, or, oh no, now I don't have the material security I had, whatever it is. It's really about abandonment to the love of God, and abandonment to the love of our family and essentially our brothers, right? It's the two great commandments. And so when you motivate from those places, you will find a well that is so deep, and our Lord is there filling it constantly, that you will find energy to do miraculous things. People will look at you and be like, how do you just like lift yourself back up over and over and over again? And you say, God does it. I don't really do it. I put myself at the feet of Our Lady, and she carries me to her son, and it works somehow. I don't know, I don't know how else to be. And that's kind of, I think, the people who are successful in long-term simple living, or long-term deep connection with the landscape, or deep connection with other people, or a constant state of giving to others. That's what they're connecting with. And that's what the land movement is trying to help people connect with. So fundamentally, it's not about material security. It's not about prepping. It's not about figuring out your way out of your 9 to 5 so you can farm every day in some blissful utopian paradise you've constructed in your mind. It's about cultivating Catholic virtue, which is often suffering, hardship, failure. Anybody who's been Catholic long enough knows that's it, right? Take up your cross. And so it changes it. It changes the whole dynamic. And I think that's why so many people are drawn to the land movement, because they want these things, and then as they want the connection with community, they want the connection with the land, and they want that deeper connection with God. But the conditions of modernity have alienated them so much from those things, they don't even know where to start, and they start off like on the wrong foot, like a bunch of different ways. And I think the land movement kind of gives people a rubric for like, hey, start off like this, and you'll be rightly oriented for your eventual progression. Not to say that, like, I have all of us have our ongoing struggles in our march up Calvary. But I think the land movement rightly orders us to, at least we're trying to get up Calvary. Most modern homesteading movements aren't even touching that, aren't even thinking about the development of your spiritual virtues. And so I think that's what sets the land movement apart, and why it's so important in the contemporary, because it does answer that question that I think people feel on the failure of modernity, whether it's liberal economics or liberal, liberal moral kind of sets or whatever, right? There's like no good and bad. You can do whatever you want, like whatever. Like it's left people in this kind of drifting, like what's real, what's true, what's good. And the land movement offers, Catholicism offers an answer to that. There is good. And that good is ordered to our Lord, and you have a place in that good, and it is one of dominion over the created world, and that dominion is good stewardship, and it integrates you, your family, your community, the land, property, natural law, a whole bunch of different things. It's a huge spectrum of like intellectual kind of development around this stuff, and the land movement helps people get invited into that discussion. Which is quite beautiful in my opinion. And so yeah, that's why I think it resonates with people and works.
We've covered a lot of ground. Last question for you. At the outset of our conversation, you referenced a number of books, authors, writings, many of which came from the period of the Industrial Revolution, when there was transformation in the economy, chaos, uncertainty, some abuses, certainly, and of course, ultimately led to the encyclical, which you referenced, Rerum Novarum, which has been central to thinking about these subjects, central to the land movement. And of course, Pope Leo has referenced it recently in his encyclical. So now I've got to pose you a question. We are undergoing another revolution, which I think it's fair to say will be equal in terms of its impact on mankind, transformative, chaos, uncertainty, certainly threats to the established order and the family. What do you have to say about the AI revolution, AI plus robotics, this latest tech development that's going to impact the lives of everybody that's living right now, and that includes Catholic families and farmers and people interested in the land movement.
Yeah, it's a great question because it really drives to the heart of the contemporary. In the same way, and you referenced it, in the same way that the Industrial Revolution kind of changed the way that people related to production, the way that people related to law, the way that people related to economy, commerce, markets. Industrialism like vastly affected those things. And in many respects, industrialism took out the human element that was existing in those various relationships in the prior period. But we see, like, right, post-industrialism, we see the manifest, most of like this, like, global citizen, the abstraction from people, from the procurement of their food, the production of their goods, labor and production patterns are like taken out of the household. That the household and the family is a very human aspect of experience, right? Local production patterns bring people into contact with what is real, which humanizes them. It's hard to exploit a cobbler that you go pick up your shoes from. It's not hard to exploit a cobbler who is 7 years old in a factory in China, because you never see her, right? So industrialism provided a type of economic and legal and kind of global environment that abstracted people from the humanness of their material and temporal conditions. AI provides an abstraction for humans of their intellectual life and almost their philosophical understandings of what being human is. What is humanity? What is intelligence? What is consciousness, right? And so I think our Pope's recent encyclical very wisely, while it addresses the economic repercussions and all these other things, it very wisely focuses us on that there are fundamental ideas of what it means to be human, what it means to possess a soul, what it means to be made in the image of God, that machine intelligence provides, if not directly, then in a tertiary way, a degrading effect on. And if we're not careful, we can lose what sight in this glorious future that technology promises us. We can lose sight of what it means to be fundamentally human. And then that's going to have, ideas, and to quote Richard Weaver, a great Southern agrarian, ideas have consequences. Right? If we begin to think like that, our legal code follows suit in all kinds of manners of, kind of debauchery, falls that we can see it in the pagan empires of yesteryear, and we can see it in the contemporary with the plight of abortion and other things, right? So if your fundamental ideas of what it means to be human and what constitutes humanity and what it means to have a human soul are malformed or disordered, these are going to have profound social consequences. And so the question becomes, those are principles, though, right? Those are intellectual understandings of the consequences of AI. What is the practical response? And this is where I think is really, really, really beautiful, because the practical remedies to AI, the practical remedies to industrialism, the practical remedies to communism, the practical remedies to a global, laissez-faire economy, the practical remedies to these various economic and political disorders and kind of malformations remains the same. That society is here, and then the civic authority is here to serve the family, and that the family is its fundamental unit. and that the family on landed property in which they can be productive provides the fundamental kind of ground with which virtue can grow. That when people become stewards of a piece of land for the benefit of their property, they become co-creators in the image of God. That's from our Catechism 2400 something. I forget the other number, but 2400. These are fundamental ideas. The remedies that they identified in yesteryear in rural England are the same remedies that we can apply today. The problems are different, but the solutions remain the same. And so we're going to continue to have more problems. There's going to always be problems, but the solutions remain the same. And our Lord gave them to us 2,000 years ago, right? Love your brother and love him, fundamentally, right? And then so that's that's the work. And so I see that just as there was a remnant back in industrialism, there was a remnant of people who said, hey, let's have common sense, there's this beautiful institution of the church that our Lord has given us. Let's ground our families in what's true, the land and community, and let's glorify our Lord through the sacraments and through prayer. That's the same answer 100 years later, right now, to AI. And I'm there in the field most days. I'm there in the field to meet my brothers in the work that it's going to take. And so, yeah, I think, I think industrial did it in a more physical way, but I think AI, it will have physical consequences, but does it in a more intellectual way, which is almost fundamentally even more dangerous. And we need the same response that we had 100 years ago. The Catholic land movement is needed today, or the alternatives, the promises of the technocratic utopia of Elon Musk, or the managed society of Chinese communism, or the morally the moral debauchery of global liberal economics. These are our other options. And like we have abortion now as this manifest of just like an absolute perversion of human intellect and social order. In the future, if we lose sight of what it means to be human, people are going to be, growing people in vats for hamburgers or something, something is equally as like atrocious as killing babies. And so we must ground people in what is real. And what is real is the created order that sings the glory of God, our place in it, and our purpose to glorify our Lord and love one another. That's what's real. And we must connect people with that. And we do that by getting people to put their hands in the dirt, recognizing hierarchy, understanding, not losing sight of the history that our Lord has given us in the church, engaging the sacraments. That's how we stay real. I think the original land movement does it's a great quote. Maybe it's a good place to close with the original land movement quote, since that's my job, right, is to carry the land movement. So this is a quote from 1932, and I think it's just as applicable today. The land movement is realist. It rejects fashion. It rejects the denial of free will, which is involved in the dogma of inevitable technological progress. It will put back the clock as far as may be necessary to ensure the happiness and integrity of man. When noon is Angelus time, the clock is right. And I think that's the general ethos of the land movement. And for anybody who's listening along and feels inspired by that, I'll meet you in the potato fields for Angelus, 12 o'clock tomorrow.
That's great, Michael. Thank you. Folks, Michael Thomas, we've been listening to, talking with many Catholic families yearn for a return to Christ-centered, productive, land-based living, but it often seems impossible. Catholic Land Movement offers the network, vision, and support to help it make a reality. Go check him out, folks, catholiclandmovement.info. We'll put all the links and contact information in the show notes. Thank you, Michael. It's been great.
Thank you, Jeff. God bless you, brother.
Peace be with you.